All right. You ready? Okay. You can sit down. It's okay. Okay. There's no prize for the end. Okay. So I already told you always. Good job. So everybody had always. Very good. Now, almost always. Very nice. Good job. Now, let's see. So over here, this side said usually, this side said sometimes. Well, I will tell you.
Nobody's right.
Yeah, nobody's right. What do you think it should be?
Sometimes.
Sometimes? Nobody's right. It's often. Often. Okay? So often should be there. Okay. And then usually. Let's see. And then sometimes. Okay. Yes, and then the rest everybody has. Rarely, hardly ever, and never. Good. Good. And I'll tell you that some people, these two and these two, they can go either way. Okay? They could go hardly ever, rarely, never, or it could go almost always, usually, often. Okay? They can go both ways. Good. So we're going to practice asking each other, how often do you do something? So I could ask, like I asked you guys, how often do you go swimming? What would you say?
I go usually.
I usually go swimming. And you could say, I usually go swimming on Saturdays. Or I usually go swimming on hot days.
Today is so hot.
Yes, today is very hot. So, Lana, how often do you read? Lana could say, I read,
Never.
or I rarely read. I never read. Or I sometimes read. Okay? Tanya, how often do you go to the park? Yes, very good. I sometimes go to the park. And that is a good thing to note, that you would say, I, and then you're going to put your adverb of frequency. Okay? So you always would say, I hardly ever go swimming. I I often go swimming.
You always go
I
swimming.
always go swimming. Okay? So, I'm going to give you a little piece of paper, and on it says, how often do you eat tomatoes? Watch TV, go skiing, go swimming, read, drink grape juice, speak English, go to the park, eat bread, and dance. Okay? So you're going to take a moment and fill this out for yourself, or you can ask someone next to you. Ask them, how often do you eat tomatoes? Okay? And you're going to fill in what they say. If I say I rarely eat tomatoes, you will write rarely. Okay?
The teacher gave the students an activity to do. We're going to do that activity too in just a moment. This is a worksheet that came on the disc with these videos. If you have that worksheet, you can do it now. If you don't have that worksheet, just follow along with us. Before we do that though, we're going to talk a bit about sentence order. When someone is wanting to ask you about frequency, they will ask you a question that begins with the words, how often do you, and then they will name the thing that they're talking about. How often asks about frequency, and the person should respond with one of these adverbs of frequency. And then we borrow the auxiliary do, so it's how often plus do, you, and then the question. Then if you're answering that, you would answer in a form that says, I blank, and then name the thing that we're doing. For example, I often go swimming. I rarely eat pizza. So the order is subject, then the adverb of frequency, and then the verb, and the rest of the sentence. Now we're going to ask each other these questions in just a moment. I'd like to show you these questions now. We will ask each other things like, how often do you eat tomatoes? How often do you watch TV? How often do you go skiing? How often do you go swimming? How often do you read? How often do you drink grape juice? How often do you speak English? How often do you go to the park? How often do you eat bread? How often do you dance? Now, in just a moment, we will stop the video and put those questions on the screen, and you can write them down if you need to. You will need those questions for this next activity. I'm going to ask you to stand up and walk around the room and talk to each other and ask each other these questions. How often do you speak English? How often do you go to the park? And then you can write down the answer that the person gives you. So you would write down their name, Sujin, for example, and then you would write down the adverb of frequency. Rarely. Sujin rarely goes to the park. And then afterwards, you can share your answers with each other, the information that you gathered. All right? So you can begin to do that now. In just a moment, we will pause the video, and I will have the questions on the screen, and you can write them down. All right? Are you ready? Let's begin. Please stop the video and do the activity.
Okay. Oh, yes. So let's hear. Yes, come on up, Tanya. And then Vika.
And then me.
So, how often do you eat tomatoes?
I sometimes eat tomatoes.
I sometimes eat tomatoes. Good job. And how about, I'm gonna skip. Okay. How often do you drink grape juice?
I always drink grape juice.
I always drink grape juice. Good job. How about, how often do you dance?
I never dance.
I never dance. Good job, good job. Let's have Vika. Vika, how often do you watch TV?
I watch TV. Always.
So you say, I always watch TV, right?
Yes.
How often do you read?
I read.
I almost always read. Good, good. How about how often do you eat bread?
Every day eat bread.
So I always eat bread. Good job, Vika. All right, Lisa. How often do you go skiing?
I go skiing.
I usually
go skiing.
Remember to use your adverb first before the action, okay? So, how often do you go to the park?
I sometimes go to the park.
Good, I sometimes go to the park. Very good. How about how often do you dance?
I always dance.
I always dance. Good job, good job. So, Misha, how often do you go skiing?
I sometimes go skiing.
Okay, good. How often do you watch TV?
I often watch TV.
Oh, very good. I often watch TV. How often do you eat bread?
I usually eat bread.
Oh, good. I usually eat bread. Very good, Misha. Very good.
The teacher is going to read the students a story now, and in this story, she uses adverbs of frequency. Now, she is going to ask the students some questions after the story. She will ask them how often people in the story do different things. So as you listen to the story, listen for the adverbs of frequency that tell you how often things happen. The teacher will read the story twice, and then she will ask the students the questions. As she asks the students, you see if you can give the correct answer as quickly as those in the class do. All right? So listen for the adverbs of frequency in this story.
So, we have one more activity. What I'm going to do, you can turn your paper over to the back if you want, and you're going to be writing on the back. Okay? I'm going to read you a story that has these words in it. And then I will ask you, how often did this man do something? Okay? So you can take notes. I will say, I will read you the first line. There once was an English student who always carried his English book with him. So I would ask you, how often does he carry his English book with him?
Always.
Always. Good. Okay? So, this is the story about an English student. There once was an English student who always carried his English book with him. He never forgot his book. Usually, he walked to the park in the morning and often sat alone on a bench to read. Occasionally, he brought food for the birds, but today he forgot. After leaving the park, he always stops at a bakery for some bread. He almost always gets the same thing, a loaf of brown bread. Sometimes he will buy a dessert. He almost never leaves the bakery, though, without talking to the baker, who speaks English. He is rarely able to speak English with someone, so he is happy to practice his English whenever he can. He rarely lets a day pass without speaking some English.
Can I say all words?
No, so I will read it one more time, and then I will ask you some questions. There once was an English student who always carried his English book with him. He never forgot his book. Usually, he walked to the park in the morning and often sat alone on a bench to read. Occasionally, he brought food for the birds, but today he forgot. After leaving the park, he always stops at a bakery for some bread. He almost always gets the same thing, a loaf of brown bread. Sometimes he will buy a dessert. He almost never leaves the bakery, though, without talking to the baker, who speaks English. He is rarely able to speak English with someone, so he is happy to practice his English whenever he can. He rarely lets a day pass without speaking some English. Okay, so how often does this English student carry an English book with him?
He never forgot, never.
So we said he always carries his English book. And how often does he forget his book?
Usually.
No,
Never.
Never. There, you had it backwards. Okay. So, how often does he walk to the park? How about somebody besides Elisa? How often do he walk to the park? Did he occasionally walk to the park?
No.
Did he?
Yes,
Usually, yes, he usually walked to the park. And how often did he sit alone on a bench to read? Always? Often? Often! Good job. He often sat alone on a bench to read. And how often did he bring food for the birds?
Usually.
You think it's usually?
Yes. Usually.
Occasionally. Occasionally he brought food for the birds, but today he forgot. After leaving the park, how often does he stop at a bakery for bread?
Often.
Sometimes, often.
Often.
I will tell you, it's neither one of these.
Often.
It's not often, and it's not sometimes.
Almost always.
Always. Good job, Misha. It's always. He always stops at the bakery for some bread.
He almost always.
And how often does he get the same thing?
Almost always.
Almost always gets the same thing. A loaf of brown bread. And how often does he buy dessert?
Sometimes.
What do you think?
Sometimes.
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes he buys a dessert. And how often does he leave the bakery without talking?
Almost.
Almost always leaves the bakery without talking to the baker?
No, usually. No. Just almost.
Never? Very close.
Usually.
Hardly ever. He hardly ever leaves the bakery without talking to the baker. And how often is he able to speak English with someone?
Almost always. Always.
He's always able to speak English with someone?
Almost.
Almost always speaks English with someone?
Never.
Never. Oh, close. He is rarely able to speak English with someone. And how often does he let a day pass?
Never.
Rarely. Good job, Leanna. Rarely. Very good.
Well, let's wrap up. What did we learn today? We usually learn something in these lessons. Today we learned about adverbs of frequency. These are the words that tell us how often something happens. Does it happen always? Does it happen never? Or does it happen somewhere in between? We use these words a lot when we're speaking English because we talk about things that we do very often and things that we don't do very often at all. For example, I could say to you, I always drink coffee,